Hello, friends. This is Angeline presenting on my integrative study of engagement with Black culture in Northwest America. I initially chose to study African Americans, which is obviously a huge demographic, so I narrowed down my focus to studying Black culture in Northwest America. However, Black culture shares significant amount of its history and context with African American culture as well. There is a delineation, however, that I will mention later. Um, Black culture in this specific area of Northwest America is a minority demographic, as opposed to other places in the US in which they are actually a majority population, such as Baltimore, Maryland, or Atlanta, Georgia. I was motivated to study this cultural group because of the current social justice issues that are occurring in the US and just the heightened political atmosphere existing around social movements such as Black Lives Matter. And I also hoped to gain some insight of a few Black individuals' perspectives, as well as explore a little bit about what reconciliation might look like between Black Americans and the majority white American culture. For my participatory research, I attended the wedding of two friends who are Black and whose guests were also predominantly Black. And I actually also later interviewed both of them at their home. I also participated in a church worship service at Mount Olivet Baptist Church in Portland, of which most of the congregants are Black. I interviewed another individual in his home, and I also volunteered at a veteran stand down event in Portland, at which I specifically tried to observe the Black US military veterans. Some of the questions that I posed in the interviews are here on the screen. So I wanted to ask kind of what their connection is with their African cultural heritage. I asked about, when they first became aware of differences based on their race, what kind of tensions they've experienced with others, both, growing up and in their adult lives. I asked about stereotypes and misconceptions that people often put on them, as well as if they feel that they share any of the cultural norms or values with general Black culture. And then ending the interviews, I also asked with how Black people have been treated historically and currently within the US. How do they think that this disparity can be reconciled? And this question was really important for me to ask just because of the motivations I had for studying this cultural group and exploring reconciliation. So I want to give you some historical and current context on this cultural group. Many Black individuals who have been here for generations and whose families have been here for generations can probably conclude that their ancestors came here initially as slaves. And obviously, slavery in the colonies was traumatic for the slaves, and their sole purpose was simply to benefit their white American slave owners. The slave owners were lawfully able to exercise total control over their slaves and essentially treated them as animals, as property, as less than human. And even after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed in 1863, Blacks in America would have to endure segregation and discrimination for well over another century. Racism was, for the most part, a deeply ingrained attitude across the nation, and it seems that it's an ideology that has been passed down through generations. Though segregation was officially eradicated, many Black Americans still experience systemic oppression through systems such as housing, the public school system, employment, and the legal and justice system. Black culture has morphed significantly over the years, from the establishment of slavery up to what it has become today in 2018. And of course, it varies greatly from place to place across the nation. But so initially, when slaves were brought to America, their African cultures and even their own individual personalities were suppressed as they were forced to assimilate or submit to the dominant white American culture. However, in the last several decades, especially since the civil rights movement in the 1960s, there seems to be a desire growing to reconnect and live into their African heritage. Social movements such as Black Lives Matter and the natural hair movement are meant to raise awareness for and also stand against the pervasiveness of police brutality and the societal standards of feminine beauty, respectively. There has also been much attention given to the significant tensions surrounding politics and individuals in power who seem to indirectly condone racism. Black Americans statistically experience poverty rates more than twice that of white Americans, which is disproportionate given the ratio of each group in the US. Many Black Americans, especially youth, are struggling in the midst of being of African heritage, yet they are culturally American. And in the midst of this, also dealing with lingering discriminations. So all of these things help to inform Black culture at large. Now I would like to share some of my findings and observations from my participatory research, which again is not perfectly representative of Black culture, but they are patterns I have found that seem to align with Black culture in Northwest America. Many Black Americans are deeply involved in the arts, such as music, movies and drama, literature, style, and fashion. And interestingly, a lot of elements of mainstream American culture have actually been derived from African or Black culture, such as language, music, including hip hop, gospel, blues, and jazz, dance, religion, cuisine, and agriculture. However, those aspects of mainstream culture aren't necessarily credited to Black culture or African American culture. Another interesting finding that I mentioned earlier and said I would explain is that there is a big distinction between being African American and being Black in America. The individuals that I interviewed specifically said that they their families have been here for generations and they actually feel too far removed from their African heritage um, to identify as African American. And so they actually identify as Black and have um, heard and agree that there is a distinction between Black and African American culture, and um, they prefer to be called Black. One of the trends I noticed in my research is the importance of family and hospitality. So, um, Black Americans tend to greet others, whether they are strangers or not, very warmly, and there's just this sense of a familial regard. Um, they may refer to women as boo or baby girl or other names like that that are not demeaning or disrespectful, but rather they are terms of endearment. And similarly, men often refer to other men, whether Black or not, as brother. And so there's just this sense of being a family and inviting others into that community, whether they identify with them or not. Another pattern that I observed is that Black individuals seem to feel the need to actively fight against stereotypes that are put on them or on the general Black culture. So they often are driven and motivated to prove everyone wrong or to rise above those stereotypes of being a thug that roams the streets or of being, unsuccessful and not worthy. Some of the individuals that I interviewed said that they feel that they have to work twice as hard as their white counterparts in school or work or whatever area of life. And there's also this sense of they are tired of being told what they can and cannot do, which also probably motivates them to have these ambitions, to have these goals, and strive for success. And Black women also may not often fit the mold of prescribed standards of beauty in America, which kind of adds a deeper meaning to the natural hair movement, of learning to live into and love their own natural beauty. In the process of this participatory research, I learned that it seems like many Black individuals are very open and willing to have conversations about reconciliation, despite all the wrongs that have been done and are being done. They are willing to talk about it and move in that direction. There also seems to be a distinct desire and need especially in Northwest America, where Black Americans are a minority. But there seems to be a need for children and youth especially to have positive role models, people from their communities or teachers who are either Black themselves or have a comprehensive understanding of the culture, who are successful and more accessible than role models such as athletes or actors or musicians. So all of this context and my small amount of research give a few implications for cross-cultural engagement. So first is cultural variance. Rogers and Steinfat, in their book Intercultural Communication, they say, "There is a great deal of cultural variance among the members of any particular ethnic population. even on variables that are the distinguishing characteristics of the ethnic group. And Lingenfelter in cross-cultural ministry, in ministering cross-culturally, reaffirms this idea that everybody has their own personal culture and everyone is a unique individual, and all of these unique individuals find commonalities with others and choose to form a community around those commonalities. Another implication is collective cultural consciousness, which is also presented in intercultural communication. So, the shared history of Black people in America gives significant insight into how they might perceive current, social justice issues that are happening in our nation. And people might say that, oh, that was so long ago, that's in our history. But this history is still very fresh in their minds. And it's something that may affect them personally, even if they themselves were not physically enslaved. It is also really important to note that acknowledgement is key. So we must acknowledge and accept what has happened in order for us to be able to move forward toward reconciliation. There is still a lot of ignorance or simply avoidance of these issues because it's an uncomfortable topic, but we have to be able to acknowledge and own what has happened. So some of the principles that are important for development and advocacy work include taking a personal inventory, which Lingenfelter talks about in Ministering Cross-Culturally. We need to be able to know and understand our own personal culture and do critical self-evaluation to see what our own biases are. And this will help us to minimize ethnocentrism, which is judging my own culture as superior to Black culture. Another principle is just education. One of the examples that I thought of for a development project concerning reconciliation would be to have presentations and discussion forums in schools, in churches, in community centers. And throughout this process, it would, one, educate others who might be ignorant about the issues and the context of Black culture and just the disparities still existing within our nation. But it also would help to affirm the valuable contributions of Black Americans. And in this project, we would need to seek input from Black individuals and Black communities and also highlight the experiences that they've had. And just be open to all the ideas and conversations about reconciliation and how to move forward in that. Another principle is to implement personal and corporate advocacy. So personal advocacy just in your everyday life, in the interactions that you have, be an advocate for others. Don't avoid or shy away from conversations because they might be uncomfortable or might cause some tensions. And we have the example of Jesus to follow because he was fully engaged in political processes of his day. He was fully, in the culture, and he advocated for others. And so we are called to do the same as Christians. And then advocating corporately. So advocate in your own personal life on an everyday basis, but also join with others, whether it's your church or a community group or starting an organization, to be advocates in a more formal manner and for more widespread justice and equality. And then also a very practical application of working towards reconciliation is to be active, be vote for representatives who are willing to be intentional, who are willing to be open to new ideas, and who will listen to all of the voices that want to share. So, in conclusion, one of the authors that I read during my archival research said, "From slavery up to today, from the cotton fields to the White House, blacks have traveled a long journey. They have fought, resisted, dreamed, and believed in themselves and in their destiny despite hostilities." So, again, as development workers and especially as Christians, we are charged with the task to embrace Black culture and the individuals that that culture is comprised of, and embrace them as Christ would. We can follow their example of extending hospitality, treating them like a family member, even if they're strangers. And we can no longer fight against them, but rather we must fight with them for justice, believing in them and dreaming alongside them the whole way. So that is the end of my presentation, and thank you for listening.